The winter of 2019 was one of the coldest Chicago had seen in years, and on the streets where nobody wanted to look twice, a 15-year-old boy was trying to survive another night. His name was Daniel, and he had been homeless for almost 2 years. Now, not because he chose this life, but because life had chosen it for him when he was certain his mother passed away from an illness that took her slowly and painfully. She was the only family he ever knew. His father had left before he was even born, and there were no grandparents or aunts or uncles who wanted to take him in. The foster system tried to place him somewhere, but Daniel had a hard time fitting in. He ran away from 3 different homes because the people there treated him like a problem they had to solve rather than a child who needed love. By the time he turned 14, he decided the streets were safer than sleeping in a house where nobody wanted him. So there he was, walking through downtown Chicago with holes in his shoes and a jacket that was too thin for this kind of weather. His fingers were numb, and his stomach had stopped growling hours ago because there was nothing left to growl for. He had eaten half a sandwich from a trash can that morning, and that was all. He had most people walk past him like he was invisible. Some crossed the street when they saw him coming. A few dropped coins in his direction without even making eye contact. Daniel had learned not to take it personally. When you live on the streets long enough, you understand that people are scared of what they do not understand, and poverty is something most people refuse to understand. But Daniel had a secret, something that kept him going even on the darkest nights. He loved music, not just any music, but the piano specifically. He could not explain when it started or why it mattered so much, but the sound of piano keys being pressed was the only thing that made him feel alive. When he was younger, before everything fell apart, his mother used to take him to the public library on Saturday mornings. There was an old piano in the corner of the community room, and sometimes volunteers would come in and play for the children. Daniel would sit there for hours, just watching their fingers move across the keys. He memorized every movement, every note, every pause. His mother noticed how much he loved it, and she promised him that one day she would save enough money to buy him a keyboard. That day never came. After she passed, Daniel held on to that dream like it was the last piece of her he had left in the streets. He found ways to keep learning. He would sneak into hotel lobbies and train stations just to hear people play. He spent hours at the library watching tutorial videos on the old computers. At night, when he found a safe corner to sleep, he would practice on a cardboard keyboard he had drawn himself. He knew it sounded crazy, a homeless kid teaching himself piano on a piece of cardboard, but it was real to him. He could hear the notes in his head, and his fingers knew exactly where to go. That December evening, Daniel was walking past the Kensington Hotel, which was one of the fanciest places in the city. Had passed by it hundreds of times before, but he never dared to go inside. People like him were not welcome in places like that. But tonight was different. The temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and Daniel could feel his body shutting down. He needed warmth, even if it was just for a few minutes. So he pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the lobby. The heat hit him immediately, and it felt like being wrapped in a warm blanket after years of being cold. The lobby was enormous, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Everything sparkled and shined, and Daniel felt like he had stepped into another world. A world where people did not have to worry about where their next meal would come from. A world where 15-year-old boys did not have to sleep under bridges. And then he saw it in the center of the lobby, sitting on a raised platform, was the most beautiful piano Daniel had ever seen. It was a grand piano painted in deep black with gold trim around the edges. The lid was open, and Daniel could see the strings inside gleaming under the chandelier lights. He stood there frozen, unable to move or breathe. His feet started walking toward it before his brain could tell them to stop. He got closer and closer, and with every step his heart beat faster. The piano was calling to him. Could feel it in his bones. There were a few people scattered around the lobby, but none of them seemed to notice him. A couple was sitting on a velvet couch near the fireplace. Talking quietly to each other, a businessman was walking toward the elevators. With his phone pressed to his ear, and in a leather chair not far from the piano, sat an older man in expensive suit reading something on a tablet. Daniel did not know who this man was. He had no idea that he was looking at Richard Kensington III, who was one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the country. The hotel they were standing in was named after his family. The piano Daniel was about to touch was worth more than most people made in a year. All Daniel knew was that the piano was right there in front of him, and his fingers were aching to touch. I'd reached out slowly and pressed one key. Sound that came out was pure and clear and beautiful. It echoed through the lobby like a bell ringing in an empty church. Daniel smiled for the first time in weeks. He pressed another key and then another. The notes floated through the air, and for a moment he forgot where he was. He forgot that he was homeless and hungry and cold. He forgot that people looked at him like he was nothing. All that existed was the music, but his moment of peace did not last long. The wealthy man in the leather chair looked up from his tablet with an expression of disgust on his face. He saw Daniel standing at the piano with his dirty clothes and unwashed hair and torn shoes. He saw a homeless kid touching something that did not belong to him. Richard Kensington stood up and walked toward Daniel. With heavy footsteps that echoed across the marble floor, he stopped a few feet away and looked at the boy like he was examining a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded. His voice was loud enough that everyone in the lobby turned to look. Daniel pulled his hands back from the piano like the keys had burned him. He started, but the words got stuck in his throat. "You were just what?" Richard interrupted. "Trying to steal something." "Trying to break something? Do you have any idea how much this piano costs?" Daniel shook his head. "No, sir." He whispered, "Of course you do not." Richard laughed. "People like you never understand the value of anything." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Security," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "We have a situation in the lobby. There is a homeless child here touching the piano. I need him removed immediately." Daniel felt his face burn with shame. Every person in the lobby was staring at him now. The couple on the velvet couch, the businessman who had stopped walking, the hotel staff behind the front desk. They were all looking at him like he was a criminal, like he had done something terrible just by existing. Richard ended his call and crossed his arms with a satisfied smile. "This is a private establishment," he said. "We do not allow just anyone to walk in off the street, especially not someone who looks like you." Daniel wanted to run. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around and get out of there as fast as he could. But something kept him planted in that spot. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the memory of his mother telling him that he was worth just as much as anyone else. "I was not trying to steal anything," Daniel said quietly. "I just wanted to play." Richard burst out laughing. "Play?" he repeated. "You wanted to play this piano?" He gestured at the Steinway like it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. "Do you even know what a piano is? Do you know how to read music? Have you ever had a lesson in your entire life?" Daniel looked at the floor. "No, sir, I have never had a lesson." Richard nodded like this confirmed everything he already believed. "Of course not," he said. "People like you do not play piano. People like you do not belong in places like this." The security guards arrived at that moment too. Large men in black uniforms who looked at Daniel with something between pity and annoyance. "Should we escort him out, sir?" one of them asked. Richard opened his mouth to say yes, but then something stopped him. A cruel idea formed in his mind. Something that would make this moment even more entertaining. "Wait," he said, holding up his hand. "I have a better idea." He turned to face the small crowd that had gathered to watch. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this young man claims he wants to play our piano. Says he taught himself without any lessons, so let us give him a chance. If he can play one song properly, just one song, I will give him $500 cash right here and right now. But if he fails, and I know he will, he leaves and never comes Back, he looked at Daniel with cold eyes. What do you say, homeless boy? Do you want to embarrass yourself in front of all these people? Or do you want to run away now while you still have some dignity left? Daniel looked at the piano. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the man who was laughing at him, and then he sat down on the bench. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Hands were shaking, but when his fingers touched the keys, something inside him went calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. This was his chance to prove that he was more than what people saw on the outside. Richard leaned against a marble pillar with a smug grin on his face. He had already pulled out his phone to record what he assumed would be a humiliating failure. The security guard stood nearby, ready to drag Daniel out the moment he messed up. The hotel staff whispered to each other behind the front desk. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting, and Daniel closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play the lobby of the Kensington Hotel. Had never been this quiet. Every single person had stopped what they were doing to watch the homeless boy sitting at the grand piano. Some of them expected him to fail immediately. Others were already feeling sorry for him, knowing this would end in humiliation. Richard Kensington stood there with his phone recording and a smile on his face that said he had already won. The security guards were positioned on either side of the piano, ready to grab Daniel the second he made a mistake. But Daniel was no longer thinking about any of them. The moment his fingers touched those ivory keys, something shifted. Inside him, all the noise in his head went silent. All the fear and shame and hunger disappeared. There was only the piano and the music that lived inside his heart. He thought about his mother, thought about the way she used to hum songs while she cooked dinner in their tiny apartment. He thought about the promise she made to buy him a keyboard one day. He thought about all the nights he spent on cold concrete practicing on cardboard, pretending the sounds were real. And then he started to play. The first note rang out clear and pure, and it hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. The second note followed, and then the third. And then his fingers began to move faster. He was playing Clair de Lune by Debussy. It was one of the most beautiful pieces of classical music ever written, and Daniel had taught himself every single note by watching videos over and over again. Melody floated through the lobby like moonlight pouring through a window. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger and more confident, like a river finding its way to the ocean. Richard Kensington stopped smiling. His phone was still recording, but his hand had started to shake. This was not what he expected. This was not what anyone expected. The couple on the velvet couch had tears streaming down their faces. Businessman had put away his phone and was standing completely still with his mouth slightly open. The hotel staff behind the front desk had stopped pretending to work and were watching in complete silence. Even the security guards had lowered their arms and were staring at Daniel like they were seeing a ghost, because what they were witnessing was impossible. A homeless 15-year-old boy with no formal training was playing one of the most difficult piano pieces in history, and he was playing it perfectly. Daniel kept his eyes closed the entire time. He did not need to look at the keys because he had memorized every movement. His fingers danced across the piano like they had been doing this for decades. Each note was filled with emotion that most professional musicians spend their entire careers trying to achieve. There was pain in the music, pain of losing his mother, the pain of being abandoned by a world that did not care about him, the pain of being invisible to everyone who walked past him on the street. But there was also hope. The hope that someday things would get better. The hope that music could save him. The hope that his mother was watching from somewhere and that she was proud. The piece built to its climax, and Daniel played with everything he had. His whole body moved with the music like he and the piano had become one. Tears were rolling down his cheeks, but he did not stop. He could not stop. This was the first time in 2 years that he felt truly alive when he played the final notes. The sound echoed through the marble lobby and slowly faded into silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed, the entire world seemed to pause, and then the applause started, began with one person clapping slowly near the elevators. Then, another person joined in, and another. Within moments, the entire lobby erupted in thunderous applause. People were standing up from their seats. Staff members were clapping behind the front desk. Guests who had been walking through stopped to join the ovation. Some people were crying openly. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. Daniel opened his eyes and looked around at the crowd. He could not understand what was happening. Nobody had ever applauded for him before. Nobody had ever looked at him with anything other than disgust or pity. But these people were looking at him like he mattered, like he was somebody worth seeing. Richard Kensington stood frozen in place. His phone had slipped from his hand and clattered to the marble floor. But he did not even notice. His face had gone pale, and his smug expression had been replaced by something that looked like shock mixed with shame. He had expected to humiliate this boy. He had expected to teach him a lesson about knowing his place. Instead, the boy had taught him something he was not ready to learn. The hotel manager came rushing out from behind the front desk. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name was Patricia, and she had worked at the Kensington for over 20 years. She had seen wealthy guests treat staff poorly more times than she could count. She had seen people like Richard Kensington use their money and power to make others feel small, but she had never seen anything like what just happened. Patricia walked straight up to Daniel and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she said softly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Daniel looked up at her, and for a moment, he did not know what to say. Nobody had asked him a question like that in a very long time. "I taught myself," he finally answered. "My mom died when I was 13, and after that, I had nowhere to go. I lived in foster homes for a while, but they were not good places, so I left. I have been on the streets ever since." Patricia felt her heart break. "How old are you?" she asked. 15, Daniel replied. The crowd that had gathered around them gasped. 15 years old, homeless for 2 years, and playing piano like a master. It did not seem possible. Richard Kensington finally found his voice. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to regain some of his dignity. That was he started, but his voice cracked, and he had to try again. "That was impressive, I admit. I suppose you earned the $500. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, but before he could take out the money, Daniel spoke. "I do not want your money." The words landed like a punch. Richard blinked in confusion. "Excuse me." Daniel stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the wealthy man directly. "You laughed at me," Daniel said. "You called security on me like I was a criminal. You made fun of me in front of all these people. Because of the way I look, you assumed I was worthless just because I am homeless." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Daniel continued. "I did not play for your money. I played because music is the only thing I have left. It is the only thing that makes me feel like a human being. You can keep your $500. I do not want anything from someone who treats people the way you do." The lobby went completely silent again. Nobody had ever spoken to Richard Kensington like that. He was worth billions of dollars. He owned buildings and companies and had powerful friends in every corner of the world. But in this moment, a 15-year-old homeless boy had stripped away all of that and shown everyone exactly who really was. Richard felt something he had not felt in decades. Shame, real, genuine shame. He looked around at the faces watching him, and for the first time he saw how they were looking at him, not with admiration or respect, but with disappointment. He was the villain in this story, and everyone knew it. Patricia stepped between them before the tension could get any worse. "Young man," she said gently to Daniel, "when was the last time you had a proper meal?" Daniel thought about it. "Yesterday morning," he admitted. "I found some food behind a restaurant." Patricia shook her head. "Come with me. I'm going to get you something to eat and a warm place to sit. We can figure out the rest later." She started to lead Daniel toward the hotel restaurant, but Richard called out, "Wait." They both turned to look at him. Richard took a deep breath. "What?" he was about to do went against every instinct. He had built over 60 years of putting himself first, but something about this boy had cracked something open inside. I was wrong, he said slowly, like the words were difficult to form. I judged you based on your appearance, and I was wrong. You have more talent in your little finger than most people will ever have in their entire lives. I am sorry. Daniel stared at him for a long moment. He had learned not to trust apologies from people who had never shown him kindness, but there was something different in the old man's eyes. Something that looked almost like regret. Before Daniel could respond, the woman's voice cut through the silence. Excuse me. Everyone turned to see a woman walking toward them from the hotel entrance. She was in her 40s, with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She was wearing an expensive coat and carrying a leather briefcase, but what caught everyone's attention was the look on her face. It was the look of someone who had just discovered something extraordinary. I saw the whole thing, she announced. I was checking in when you started playing. She stopped in front of Daniel and studied him carefully. My name is Victoria, and I am a music producer. I have worked with some of the biggest names in the classical music world. What you just did on that piano was one of the most remarkable things I have ever witnessed in my 30 years. In this industry, Daniel did not know how to respond to music producer, someone who worked with real musicians, someone who could change his entire life. Victoria reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. Want to help you, she said. I do not know your full story yet, but I know talent when I see it, and you, young man, have a gift that the world needs to hear. She handed him the card. Daniel looked down at it with trembling hands. This could not be real. Things like this did not happen to people like him, but the card was solid in his fingers. The words were printed clearly. Victoria was looking at him with complete sincerity. Call me tomorrow, she said. We have a lot to talk about. And then she walked toward the front desk to finish checking in, like she had not just changed the entire direction of a young boy's life. Daniel stood there, holding the card, unable to move. Patricia put her arm around his shoulder. Come on, she said with a warm smile. Let us get you some food first. You can think about the future after you have eaten. As they walked toward the restaurant, Daniel glanced back one more time at the grand piano. It sat there gleaming under the chandelier lights like it had been waiting for him all along, and for the first time in 2 years, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe his life was about to change. That night, Daniel slept in a real bed for the first time in almost 2 years. Patricia had arranged for him to stay in one of the hotel's smaller rooms on the ground floor. It was nothing fancy compared to the luxury suites upstairs, but to Daniel, it felt like a palace. There were clean white sheets and fluffy pillows and a bathroom with hot running water. He stood under the shower for nearly an hour, just letting the warmth wash over his skin. He had forgotten what it felt like to be truly clean. When he finally climbed into bed, he expected to fall asleep immediately, but his mind would not stop racing. He kept thinking about everything that had happened in the lobby, the way his fingers had moved across those piano keys like they had a life of their own, the sound of applause echoing off the marble walls, the look on Richard Kensington's face when he realized he had been wrong about everything, and Victoria, the music producer, who had appeared out of nowhere and handed him a business card like it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel pulled the card out of his pocket and stared at it. In the dim light, Victoria Chun, executive producer, Monarch Classical Music Productions. There was a phone number at the bottom and an email address. This tiny piece of paper represented everything Daniel had ever dreamed about: a chance to make something of himself, a chance to prove that he was more than just a homeless kid that nobody wanted. But as the hours passed, doubt started to creep into his mind. What if she had changed her mind? What if she woke up tomorrow and realized she had made a mistake? What if this was all just some cruel joke, and the universe was setting him up for another disappointment? Daniel had learned the hard way not to trust good things. Every time something good happened in his life, it was followed by something terrible. His Mother had been the best thing in his world, and then she was gone. The foster families were supposed to give him a home, but they only gave him pain. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone like him, but still he held on to that business card like it was made of gold. He finally fell asleep sometime after midnight with the card still clutched in his hand. The next morning, Patricia knocked on his door at 8 o'clock, brought him breakfast on a scrambled eggs and toast and fresh orange juice and a cup of hot chocolate. Daniel ate so fast he almost choked. Patricia watched him with sad eyes, knowing that this boy had probably not had a proper meal in longer than she wanted to imagine. After he finished eating, she sat down in the chair across from him. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said gently. Daniel nodded, but did not say anything. "Spoke with Child Protective Services this morning," Patricia continued. "They want to place you in a foster home." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "No," he said immediately. I'm not going back to foster care. I would rather live on the streets." Patricia held up her hand. "Let me finish. I told them about what happened last night. I told them about your talent and about Victoria offering to help you. They agreed to hold off on placing you anywhere until we figure out a better solution." Daniel let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. "What kind of solution?" he asked. Patricia smiled. "That depends on you. Are you going to call Victoria today?" Daniel looked down at the business card still sitting on the nightstand. "I want to," he admitted. "But what if she does not answer? What if she forgot about me?" "There is only one way to find out," Patricia said. He handed him a cell phone. "Use this." Daniel's hands were shaking as he dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He was about to hang up when someone answered. "This is Victoria." Daniel froze. For a moment he could not remember how to speak. "Hello," Victoria said again. "Is anyone there?" "It is me," Daniel finally managed to say. "The boy from the hotel, from last night." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel felt his heart sink. She had forgotten, of course. She had forgotten. Why would someone like her remember someone like him? But then Victoria spoke, and her voice was warm and excited. "Daniel, I have been waiting for your Callie. Was hoping you would reach out this morning. Can you meet me today? I have something important I want to discuss with you." 2 hours later, Daniel was sitting in a coffee shop across the street from the hotel. Patricia had given him some clean clothes that belonged to her son, who was away at college. They were a little big on him, but they were better than the torn and dirty things he had been wearing. Victoria arrived exactly on time. She ordered 2 cups of tea and sat down across from Daniel with a serious expression on her face. "I need to ask you some questions," she said, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." Daniel nodded. "How long have you been playing piano?" Daniel thought about it. "I started watching people play when I was about 7, but I did not really start practicing until after my mom died, so about 2 years, I guess." Victoria shook her head in disbelief. "2 years," she repeated. "You taught yourself to play Debussy in 2 years with no formal training?" Daniel shrugged. "I watched a lot of videos. I practiced every day. Even when I did not have a real piano, I made a keyboard out of cardboard, and I would practice on that. I know it sounds crazy, but I could hear the music in my head. I knew what it was supposed to sound like, even when I could not make the sound." Victoria leaned back in her chair and studied him carefully. "You know what a prodigy is?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "Prodigy is someone who has extraordinary talent at a young age," she explained. "Someone who can do things that most people cannot do even after years of training." Mozart was a prodigy. He was composing music when he was 5 years old. I think you might be a prodigy too." Daniel did not know what to say. He had never thought of himself as anything special. He was just a kid who loved music and had nowhere else to go. Victoria continued, "I want to help you, but I need you to understand what that means. If we do this, it will not be easy. You will have to work harder than you have ever worked in your life. You will have to study music theory and learn to read sheet music properly. You will have to practice for hours every single day, and you will have to trust me, even when things get difficult." Are you willing to do that? Daniel looked at her and saw that she was completely serious. This was not charity. This was not pity. She was offering him a real chance, but only if he was willing to earn it. Yes, he said firmly. I will do whatever it takes. Victoria smiled. Good, because I've already made some calls. There is a music academy here in Chicago that has agreed to give you a full scholarship. You will live on campus and attend classes with other students your age. We'll have access to practice rooms and real pianos and teachers who can help you develop your gift. But there is one condition. Daniel felt his heart racing. What condition? Victoria took a deep breath. The academy is prestigious. They do not usually accept students who have not been formally trained. They are making an exception for you because I vouched for your talent. But you will have to audition in front of the entire faculty in 2 weeks. If you pass the audition, you are in. If you fail, they will not give you another chance. 2 weeks. Daniel had 2 weeks to prepare for the most important performance of his life. It seemed impossible. But then again, everything that had happened in the last 24 hours seemed impossible. I can do it, he said. Victoria nodded. I believe you can. Now let us get to work. Over the next 14 days, Daniel's life transformed in ways he never could have imagined. Victoria arranged for him to stay at a small apartment near the academy. She hired a private tutor to teach him music theory and help him prepare for the audition. She bought him new clothes and made sure he had 3 meals a day. For the first time since his mother died, Daniel felt like someone actually cared about him. But the work was brutal. He practiced piano for 8 to 10 hours every day. His fingers cramped and his back ached from sitting at the bench for so long. There were moments when he wanted to give up, moments when he felt like he was not good enough, moments when the voice in his head told him he was fooling everyone and that he would fail just like he had failed at everything else. But every time he felt like quitting, he thought about his mother. He thought about the promise she made to buy him a keyboard. He thought about how proud she would be if she could see him now, and he kept going. The night before the audition, Daniel could not sleep. Lay in bed staring at the ceiling with his heart pounding in his chest. Tomorrow would decide everything. If he passed, he would have a future. If he failed, he would be back on the streets with nothing. Victoria had told him to play the same piece he played at the Hotel Claire de Lune, but she also wanted him to play something else, something that showed his range and his emotional depth together. They had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for piano. Professional musicians spent years mastering it. Daniel had 2 weeks, but he had practiced it until his fingers bled. He had played it so many times he could do it in his sleep. Now, all he had to do was perform it in front of a room full of people who would decide his fate. The morning of the audition arrived cold and gray. Daniel put on the suit that Victoria had bought him. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. He looked like a real musician. He looked like someone who belonged. Victoria picked him up in her car and drove him to the academy. The building was old and beautiful with tall columns and stained glass windows. Students walked across the campus carrying instrument cases and talking about composers Daniel had only read about. This was a different world, a world he desperately wanted to be part of. They walked through the front doors and down a long hallway until they reached the auditorium. Victoria stopped outside the door and turned to face him. "This is it," she said. "Are you ready?" Daniel took a deep breath. "No," he admitted, "but I'm going to do it anyway." Victoria smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "That is the right answer." She opened the door, and Daniel stepped inside. Auditorium was huge, with hundreds of empty seats facing a stage, but the seats were not completely empty. In the front row sat 12 people, the faculty of the academy. They were all looking at him, judging him, waiting to see if he was worth their time. Daniel walked to the piano on the stage. His legs felt like they were made of water. His hands were trembling. But when he sat down on the bench, something changed. The same thing that happened at the hotel. The fear melted away. The doubt disappeared. There was only him and the piano and the music that lived inside his soul. He placed his fingers on the keys, closed his eyes, and began to play. The first note echoed through the empty auditorium like a heartbeat. Daniel kept his eyes closed and let his fingers find their way across the keys. He started with Clair de Lune, just like Victoria had told him to. The melody was soft and gentle like moonlight falling on water. It filled the room with a kind of sadness that words could never describe. In the front row, the 12 faculty members sat perfectly still. Some of them had been teaching music for over 40 years. They had seen hundreds of auditions from students who came from wealthy families and prestigious music schools. Students who had been training since they were 3 years old. Students who had the best teachers and the best instruments money could buy. But none of them had ever seen anything like this. A homeless boy who taught himself piano on a cardboard keyboard. It sounded like a story someone made up. Most of them had not believed it when Victoria first told them. They agreed to the audition mostly as a favor to her because she had connections in the industry that they did not want to lose. But now, as they listened to Daniel play, they began to understand this was not just talent. This was something else entirely. This was a gift that came along once in a generation. Daniel finished Clair de Lune and paused for just a moment. He could feel the silence pressing against him like a weight. He wanted to open his eyes and look at the judges, but he was afraid of what he might see. So instead, he took a breath and moved into his second piece, Chopin's Ballade Number 1 in G minor. The music started slowly building like a storm gathering on the horizon. Then it exploded into a cascade of notes that filled every corner of the auditorium. Daniel's fingers flew across the keys faster than anyone watching could follow. But it was not just speed. It was emotion, raw and powerful and completely unfiltered. He played like someone who had nothing left to lose, because for most of his life that had been true. Every note carried the weight of everything he had been through, the hunger and the cold and the loneliness. The foster homes where nobody wanted him. The nights spent sleeping under bridges wondering if he would survive until morning. The memory of his mother's voice telling him she loved him before she closed her eyes for the last time. All of it poured out through his fingers and into the music. By the time he reached the final movement, tears were streaming down his face, but he did not stop. He could not stop. This was bigger than him now. This was everything he had ever been and everything he hoped to become. The last note rang out and slowly faded into silence. Daniel sat at the piano with his hands still resting on the keys. His whole body was shaking. He had given everything he had. There was nothing left. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved then. One of the faculty members in the front row stood up. He was an older man with white hair and glasses and a stern expression that had not changed once during the entire performance. His name was Professor William Chen, and he was the head of the piano department. Had taught at the academy for 37 years, and he was known for being impossible to impress. Students feared him because he never gave compliments. He believed that praise made young musicians lazy, and that only criticism could push them to greatness. But as he stood there looking at Daniel, something in his face shifted. He started to clap slowly at first, then faster. One by one, the other faculty members rose from their seats and joined him. Within seconds, all 12 of them were on their feet, giving Daniel a standing ovation. Daniel finally opened his eyes and looked out at them. He could not believe what he was seeing. These were the most respected music educators in the country, and they were applauding for him. A kid who had been sleeping on the streets just 2 weeks ago, Victoria, was standing at the back of the auditorium with tears running down her cheeks. She had believed in him from the moment she heard him play at the hotel, but even she had not expected this. Professor Chen walked toward the stage and climbed the steps until he was standing right next to Daniel. "Young man," he said in a voice that carried through the entire room, "in all my years of teaching, I have never witnessed anything like what you just did. You played Chopin's Ballade with more feeling and more precision than musicians twice your age who have been training Their entire lives I do not know how you taught yourself to play like this. I do not understand how it is even possible. But I do know one thing: you belong here. Welcome to the academy. Daniel felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He had done I had actually done it. The next 3 years were the hardest and most rewarding of Daniel's life. He threw himself into his studies with a dedication that surprised even his teachers. Was the first one in the practice rooms every morning, and the last one to leave at night. He learned music theory and composition, and the history of classical music from ancient times to the modern era. He studied the great composers and analyzed their techniques until he could understand not just how they created their masterpieces, but why. But it was not always easy. Some of the other students did not accept him. They came from wealthy families and had been groomed for success since birth. They looked at Daniel and saw someone who did not belong, someone who had snuck in through a back door that should have been closed to people like him. A boy named Theodore was the worst of them. His father was a famous conductor, and his mother was a concert pianist. He had been trained at the finest schools in Europe, and he believed he was destined for greatness. When he found out about Daniel's background, he made it his mission to remind Daniel every single day that he did not belong. "You will never be one of us," Theodore would say. "You can put on nice clothes and learn to read music, but you will always be a street kid. You got lucky once, but luck does not last forever." Daniel tried to ignore him, but the words still hurt. There were nights when he lay in his dorm room and wondered if Theodore was right. Maybe he was fooling everyone. Maybe one day they would all realize he was a fraud and send him back to the streets where he came from. But every time those thoughts crept into his mind, he would get up and go to the practice room. He would sit at the piano and play until his fingers ached, because music was the one thing that never lied to him. Music did not care where he came from or what he looked like. Music only cared about what he could create, and Daniel could create something beautiful in his second year at the academy. Daniel entered a national piano competition. It was the most prestigious competition for young musicians in the country. Winners often went on to perform at Carnegie Hall and sign recording contracts with major labels. Theodore entered the same competition. He had been preparing for it his entire life, and he was convinced he would win. The competition was held in New York City in a grand concert hall with over 2,000 seats. Daniel had never performed in front of so many people before. When he walked out onto the stage and saw the crowd stretching back into the darkness, he felt his knees go weak. But then he sat down at the piano and everything else disappeared. He played a piece he had been working on for months. It was his own composition, something he had written based on his experiences growing up on the streets. He called it Moonlight on Concrete. It started with a simple melody that represented the loneliness of those cold nights. Then it built into something bigger as other instruments in his imagination joined the piano. Even though it was just him playing, you could almost hear an entire orchestra. The piece told the story of struggle and survival, and eventually hope. When he finished, the audience erupted. People were on their feet, cheering and clapping, and some were even crying. Daniel had never felt anything like it. Theodore performed next, and he played flawlessly. Every note was perfect and precise, but there was something missing. His music was technically brilliant, but it lacked soul. It was like looking at a beautiful painting that had no meaning behind it. When the judges announced the results, Daniel could not breathe. Third place went to a girl from California, second place went to Theodore, and first place went to Daniel. Theodore's face turned red with anger. He stormed off the stage without shaking anyone's hand. Later that night, he confronted Daniel backstage. "This is not over," he spat. "You got lucky again, but your luck is going to run out one day. Everyone will see you for what you really are. Nobody pretending to be somebody." Daniel looked at him calmly. "Maybe you are right," he said. "Maybe I'm nobody, but I would rather be a nobody who plays with heart than a somebody who plays with nothing but ego." Theodore had no response. He turned and walked away, and Daniel never heard from him again. After the competition, everything changed. Record labels started calling concert halls wanted to book him. Newspapers and magazines ran stories about the homeless boy who became a piano prodigy. Daniel was suddenly famous, but fame did not change who he was. He still practiced every day. He still worked harder than anyone around him. He never forgot where he came from. Victoria remained his manager and his mentor. She guided him through the complicated world of professional music and protected him from people who only wanted to use him for his story. She became like a second mother to him, someone he could trust completely. By the time Daniel turned 18, he had performed in concert halls across the country, had released his first album, which went to the top of the classical music charts. He had been featured on television shows and interviewed by famous journalists, but there was one thing he had not done yet. He had not gone back to the Kensington Hotel. He had not seen Richard Kensington since that night in the lobby when everything began. Part of him wanted to forget about that man entirely. Richard had humiliated him and laughed at him and treated him like garbage. Why should Daniel give him another moment of his thoughts? But another part of him knew that the story was not complete. There was unfinished business between them, and soon Daniel would have the chance to close that chapter once and for all, because he had just received an invitation to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York City, the most famous concert venue in the entire world. And on the guest list was one name that stood out above all the others: Richard Kensington III. The night of the Carnegie Hall performance was everything Daniel had ever dreamed of. 3,000 people filled the seats waiting to hear him play. Stood backstage in a black suit with his heart pounding against his ribs. Victoria squeezed his hand and told him she was proud of him no matter what happened. Daniel walked onto that legendary stage, and the audience erupted in applause. He saw faces stretching back into the darkness and camera flashes blinking like stars. And there in the front row sat Richard Kensington, the same man who had laughed at him 4 years ago in that hotel lobby, the same man who called security on a freezing homeless boy just for touching a piano. Their eyes met for just a moment. Daniel sat down and placed his fingers on the keys. He played like he had never played before. Every note carried the weight of his journey from the streets to the stage. The loneliness and the hunger and the cold nights under bridges, the cardboard keyboard and the library computers, and the dream that kept him alive. When he finished, the entire audience rose to their feet. Sound of their applause washed over him like a wave. Daniel looked at Richard and saw something he never expected. The billionaire was crying after the show. Richard requested a private meeting backstage. Daniel agreed. Old man walked into the room with tears still wet on his cheeks. He looked smaller somehow, less powerful than Daniel remembered. "I have thought about that night every single day," Richard said quietly. "I was cruel to you, and I had no right to be. You were just a child looking for warmth, and I treated you like you were worthless." Daniel listened without speaking. Richard continued. "After you left the hotel that night, something changed inside. I could not stop thinking about what I had done, so I started donating money to shelters and music programs for homeless youth. I did it anonymously because I was ashamed. I wanted to make up for what I did to you, but I knew money could never be enough." He paused and took a shaky breath. "I am sorry, Daniele, am truly sorry." Daniel looked at the man who had once made him feel like nothing. He thought about all the anger he had carried for so long, and then he let it go. "I forgave you a long time ago." Daniel said, "Your cruelty that night did not break me. It made me want to prove that every person has value, no matter where they come from." Richard nodded with tears falling freely. "Now you did more than prove it," he whispered. "You showed the whole world." They shook hands and something heavy lifted from both of them. That night, Daniel performed an encore for the crowd. He played Claire de Lune one more time, and somewhere up above, he knew his mother was watching, smiling, proud of the boy who turned pain into music and music into hope. The end.